Rome had ruled the known world for centuries. Its legions marched across deserts, mountains, oceans. Its armies crushed every rival that dared challenge it. For generations, Rome had seemed eternal, but by the year 270 AD, Rome was dying. The empire had shattered into pieces. In the west, Gaul and Britain gone. In the east, Palmyra rising. And between them, what remained of Rome struggled just to survive. Barbarian tribes crossed the borders every year. Cities burned. Trade collapsed. The army no longer protected the empire. The army chose its emperors, and then it killed them. In 50 years, more than 20 emperors. Most ruled for months. Very few died naturally. The Roman Empire had entered what historians would call the crisis of the 3rd century. Total systemic collapse. Too large to govern, too divided to defend, too exhausted to rebuild. Many believed the truth was unavoidable. Rome would never be united again. The empire that had ruled the world for 500 years was finished. But history sometimes turns on the will of a single man. Not a prince, not a senator, a soldier. His name was Aurelian, born on the harsh frontiers of the empire, not nobility, not philosophy. Discipline, strength, and loyalty. He joined the Roman army, and he rose, not because of birth, but because of something the legions respected more than anything else: competence. He was relentless. He demanded discipline. He tolerated no weakness. And in an empire where generals plotted against each other, Aurelian was known for something rare: absolute loyalty to the survival of Rome. In the year 270, after yet another emperor was killed, the army turned to Aurelian. Not because he was loved, because he might be the only man capable of saving what remained. And what remained was almost nothing. The empire was surrounded, the treasury empty. 3 separate powers claimed the legacy of Rome, and the capital itself was no longer safe. For 800 years, Rome had never needed walls. But Aurelian understood something most Romans refused to accept. Rome was no longer invincible. So he made a decision that shocked the empire. He ordered walls built around Rome itself, the Aurelian walls. For the first time in centuries, Rome admitted fear. But Aurelian had no interest in symbolism. He was interested in survival, and survival required war. First came the barbarians. Gothic tribes had poured into the Balkans, ravaging entire provinces. Previous emperors defended the frontier. Aurelian crossed it. The battles were brutal. Roman discipline against desperate tribes fighting for survival. And slowly, victory returned. But the barbarian invasions were not the real threat. The true danger lay inside the empire itself. In the east, a powerful kingdom had risen. Queen Zenobia of Palmyra had built a rival empire. Her armies controlled Egypt, the trade routes, the richest cities in the ancient world, and increasingly, they spoke not as allies of Rome, but as its replacement. If Aurelian failed here, Rome would never recover. So he marched east, across Anatolia, across Syria, across the desert. The campaign was relentless. City after city fell, until finally the armies met. The battle that followed would decide the fate of the empire. Against all expectations, Aurelian won. Zenobia's forces collapsed, her empire disintegrated, and the east returned to Roman control. But the empire was still divided. In the west, the Gallic Empire still ruled Gaul and Britain. Aurelian marched again, across the Alps, toward the final confrontation. The battle was decisive. The Gallic emperor surrendered, and for the first time in years, the Roman Empire was whole again. The Senate gave Aurelian a title few rulers had ever received: Restitutor Orbis, the restorer of the world. In just 5 years, he had done the impossible: reunited Rome defeated every rival, rebuilt the authority of the empire. History would remember him as the man who saved Rome. But history often forgets something else. Power creates enemies, and the greater the power, the greater the fear. In the year 275 AD, while preparing another campaign, Aurelian was murdered. Not by barbarians, not by rival emperors, by his own officers. Men who believed he intended to execute them. The savior of Rome, killed by the very system he had rebuilt. Yet the empire he restored would endure for another 2 centuries. Long after the man himself was gone, sometimes the men who save the world do not live to see it thank them. Subscribe and write in the comments which historical figure do you want to see next.